Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. The Last Words. Eleanor Whitcomb's labored breaths filled the dimly lit room. A single candle flickered on the bedside table, casting long shadows across her gaunt face. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and medicine. Beatrice Lane, her nurse, dabbed her forehead with a damp cloth, her movements brisk but careful. "You mustn't strain yourself, Mrs. Whitcomb," Beatrice murmured, glancing at the frail woman's trembling hands. Eleanor's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the air, the letter, the sins." Beatrice frowned. "What did you say?" Eleanor tried to speak again, but the effort sent her into a violent coughing fit. A tremor passed through her thin frame, and within seconds, her head slumped to the side. The candlelight wavered, as if acknowledging the shift in the room. Beatrice straightened abruptly. Her pulse quickened as she leaned closer, pressing her fingers to Eleanor's wrist. Nothing. The old woman was gone. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Beatrice turned just as Jonathan Whitcomb strode in, his sharp blue eyes narrowing at the scene before him. "What's happened?" His voice was tense. Beatrice swallowed. "She's gone." Jonathan's jaw tightened. His gaze darted to his stepmother's lifeless form, then back to Beatrice. Did she say anything before she died?" Beatrice hesitated. The words still rang in her ears. Not the air, the letter, the sins. But what did they mean? "No," she said finally, folding her hands in her lap. "Nothing of importance." Jonathan exhaled and raked a hand through his hair. "I see," but the flicker of something relief, frustration, in his eyes did not go unnoticed. The next morning, Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the Whitcomb residence's sitting room, her knitting needles clicking softly. She had arrived early, as she often did when tragedy struck the village. Her presence was unassuming, her manner gentle, yet her eyes missed nothing. Inspector Harold Grayson stood near the fireplace, notebook in hand. "A natural death," he declared. The doctor confirmed Mrs. Whitcomb's heart had been weak for some time. "A terrible loss," murmured Reverend Samuel Finch, his weathered hands clasped before him. Eleanor was a pillar of this community. Jonathan, seated stiffly near the window, said nothing. His gaze was fixed outside, where a mist clung to the HEDGEROWS. Miss Marple's voice, warm but sharp, broke the quiet. "Did Mrs. Whitcomb say anything before she passed?" Beatrice, who had been standing near the door, flinched. Jonathan, however, spoke first. "No. She was unconscious by the time I arrived." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "I see." She turned to Beatrice, her expression mild. "And you, my dear? You were with her at the end, weren't you?" Beatrice's hands tightened around the back of a chair. She was incoherent, just mumbling. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Mumbling what, exactly?" Beatrice hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Nothing that made sense. Inspector Grayson, oblivious to the tension in the room, snapped his notebook shut. "Well, that settles it then. There's no case here. Just a woman who lived a long life and met a peaceful end." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes remained thoughtful. Perhaps, just then, Harriet Longford, the village gossip, bustled into the room. Her cheeks flushed. "Oh, it's simply dreadful. But I do say, there was something odd about Eleanor these past few weeks." She kept mentioning unfinished business. Reverend Finch's grip on his walking stick tightened, and Jonathan's expression darkened. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "Unfinished business, you say?" Harriet nodded eagerly. "Yes, something about making amends for the past." A thoughtful silence settled over the room. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the assembled faces. Secrets were like loose threads in a tapestry. Tug at them gently, and the whole picture would start to unravel. And unravel it would. Chapter 2. Ominous inheritance. Day after Eleanor Whitcomb's passing, a hush settled over the village. The news had spread quickly, as it always did in places like St. Mary Mead. At the Whitcomb residence, the morning light struggled through gray clouds, casting an eerie glow upon the drawing room, where the key players in Eleanor's life had gathered. Jonathan Whitcomb sat stiffly in an armchair, his hands clasped together as if restraining his own impatience. Beatrice Lane stood near the mantelpiece, her fingers toying with the clasp of her nursing apron. Reverend Finch leaned on his walking stick, his expression a careful mask of solemnity. Harriet Longford, ever eager for details, perched on the edge of the sofa. Miss Marple, of course, was there too, her knitting needles at rest in her lap. She watched the room, her kindly blue eyes missing nothing. Inspector Grayson arrived with an air of finality, as though he had already closed the matter in his mind. Dr. Pembroke confirms Mrs. Whitcomb's death as heart failure, he announced. A natural passing, nothing suspicious. There was a brief silence, then Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Well, at least that's settled. Miss Marple's voice was mild. One might say so. Jonathan's eyes flicked to her, narrowing slightly, but before he could respond, the solicitor arrived. Mr. Alfred Carmichael, a wiry man with thin spectacles, stepped into the room, clutching a leather-bound folder. He wasted no time in taking his place at the writing desk. I trust we are all ready, Carmichael said. Mrs. Whitcomb made some adjustments to her will in recent weeks, though the primary inheritance remains unchanged. A hush fell over the room. Jonathan leaned forward ever so slightly. Carmichael cleared his throat. To my stepson, Jonathan Whitcomb, I leave the family estate, including all properties and financial holdings. Jonathan released a slow breath, though his expression betrayed nothing. To my dear friend Harriet Longford, a sum of £5,000. Harriet blinked, visibly startled. Oh, how very kind of her, she murmured. To Beatrice Lane, who cared for me in my final days, a sum of £3,000. Beatrice's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Carmichael continued, flipping a page. However, there is one final matter. Mrs. Whitcomb left a sealed letter to be delivered to Jonathan Whitcomb upon her passing. It is marked to be read in absolute privacy. At this, Jonathan stiffened. A letter. Carmichael nodded, and produced a cream-colored envelope, the edges slightly yellowed. He extended it to Jonathan, who hesitated for only a fraction of a second before taking it. Miss Marple noted how tightly he gripped it. I shall take my leave, Carmichael said, standing. If there are no disputes, my duties are complete. No one spoke. The solicitor nodded once and departed, leaving behind an odd silence. Jonathan rose abruptly. If you'll excuse me. He turned and strode out, the letter clutched in his hand. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. Beatrice exhaled softly. A letter? Harriet, ever curious, leaned forward. What on earth could Eleanor have needed to say that she hadn't already? Reverend Finch, who had been quiet thus far, finally spoke. Perhaps she wished to ease her conscience before the end. Harriet scoffed. Conscience. Eleanor had nothing to confess. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Are you quite sure, my dear? Harriet hesitated for just a moment. Reverend Finch cleared his throat. Well, regardless, the matter is now closed. Mrs. Whitcomb has left her affairs in order. It is not for us to pry. No one argued, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his hat. That evening, Miss Marple found herself at the vicarage for tea with Reverend Finch. The clergyman was polite as ever, but there was something in his manner and unease lurking beneath his practiced calm. Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. You seemed quite troubled this morning. Reverend Finch glanced up, startled. Troubled? No, just weary. Miss Marple smiled, but did not press him. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Finally, the Reverend sighed. It is unsettling, that's all. Eleanor was a formidable woman, but if she did have regrets, he hesitated. Well, we all have things we might wish to atone for. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Yes, I dare say we do. Finch shifted in his seat, as though suddenly uncomfortable that. At that moment, a knock at the door interrupted them. A housemaid entered, looking flustered. Reverend, sir, there's a matter at the Whitcomb house. Miss Marple straightened, ever so slightly. What sort of matter? Finch asked. It's Mr. Whitcomb, the maid said hesitantly. He's locked himself in the study. Won't answer the door. And there was a terrible crash. Reverend Finch paled. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Well, she said, rising, perhaps we ought to see what's amiss. When they arrived at the Whitcomb estate, Inspector Grayson was already there, standing at the study door, with a look of irritation. A few of the house staff lingered anxiously nearby. He hasn't responded to knocking, Grayson said gruffly. Says he wants to be left alone. Miss Marple stepped forward, placing a delicate hand against the polished wood. Mr. Whit, she called gently. There was no answer. Grayson exhaled sharply. This is nonsense. He rapped his knuckles against the door. Jonathan, open up. You're alarming the staff. A long silence. Then, finally, the sound of a key turning. The door creaked open, revealing Jonathan. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but Miss Marple noted the trembling in his fingers. Grayson frowned. What's all this about? Jonathan exhaled slowly. His voice was hoarse. I read the letter. Miss Marple tilted her head. And Jonathan swallowed. It changes everything. A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the desk, where the crumpled envelope lay. A single sheet of paper rested beside it. The ink was smudged, but she could make out the first few words. Jonathan, I must tell you the truth before it is too late. The air in the room felt suddenly heavier. Miss Marple folded her hands. Perhaps, dear boy, you should tell us exactly what it says. Jonathan's fingers clenched around the paper. His next words sent a ripple of shock through the room. She lied, he murmured. She lied about everything. A shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. Eleanor Whitcomb might have been dead, but her secrets were only just beginning to surface. Chapter 3. The letters secreta. Heavy silence filled the study, the air thick with unspoken tension. Jonathan Whitcomb stood near the desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the letter. His face, usually composed, bore the unmistakable strain of a man grappling with something deeply unsettling. Miss Marple, ever patient, sat in a nearby chair, her delicate hands folded in her lap. Would you care to share, dear boy? She asked gently. Inspector Grayson, less inclined toward delicacy, crossed his arms. Enough theatrics, Whitcomb. If this letter's as damning as you say, let's hear it. Jonathan hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and then, with visible reluctance, he began to read aloud. Jonathan, I must tell you the truth before it is too late. You have lived your life believing you are the rightful heir to the Whitcomb estate. That was my doing. I let you believe it because I wished to protect you from the truth and from what it might mean. But I can no longer carry this secret. The real heir is not you. A murmur rippled through the room. Harriet Longford gasped audibly, while Beatrice Lane paled. Jonathan's grip tightened on the paper. It goes on, he said hoarsely, and continued. Years ago, my late husband had a child out of wedlock, a daughter. She was the true bloodline of the Whitcomb name. When she died under unfortunate circumstances, I concealed the truth. You were the closest relative, and I allowed you to inherit what was never meant to be yours. But there were those who knew, and I fear now that someone will try to use this against you. Find the letter I hid. It will tell you everything. Silence. The weight of the revelation settled over them like a thick fog. Grayson let out a sharp breath. Well, that's a bloody mess. Miss Marple, however, appeared entirely unshaken. A daughter, she murmured, and a letter hidden somewhere. How very interesting. Jonathan let the paper slip from his fingers onto the desk. If this is true, I have no right to the estate. His voice was hollow. My entire life built on a lie. Beatrice Lane, who had remained unusually quiet, suddenly spoke. And what of this hidden letter? Where would Eleanor have kept it? Jonathan shook his head. I have no idea. I barely had time to process this before you all arrived. Harriet Longford, who had been uncharacteristically silent, cleared her throat. Well, it stands to reason that if she hid one letter, she could have hidden another. Perhaps she had a safe or a locked drawer somewhere. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Now that is a clever thought, Harriet. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. If there is another letter, I've no clue where to start looking. Reverend Finch, who had been standing stiffly by the window, finally spoke. Are we to believe that Eleanor carried this burden all these years? That she lived with the knowledge of an illegitimate child's death and never spoke of it? Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward him. That does seem rather difficult, wouldn't you say? Finch's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Grayson exhaled through his nose. If you ask me, there's nothing criminal here, just a case of long-buried family secrets. He gave Jonathan a pointed look. Your fortune's still yours, unless someone comes forward with a legal claim. Jonathan did not reply. Miss Marple, however, continued thoughtfully. But then, why did Eleanor feel the need to confess at the very end? And why did she utter those peculiar last words? Not the heir, the letter, the sins. No one had an answer. A search for the truth. Whitcomb House took on an air of quiet urgency in the days that followed. Though Inspector Grayson had dismissed the matter as a family issue, Miss Marple knew better. Secrets, particularly those as old as this one, had a way of resurfacing. Jonathan, determined to uncover the truth, began searching the house for any trace of Eleanor's hidden letter. He rifled through desk drawers, overturned bookshelves, and even tapped at the walls for hollow spaces. But nothing emerged. It was Beatrice Lane, however, who stumbled upon something unusual. She had been tending to the last of Eleanor's belongings when she noticed a small locked drawer in the lady's writing desk. A keyhole gleamed in the dim light. She hesitated only a moment before calling for Jonathan. "There's something here," she said, her voice hushed. Jonathan knelt beside her, his pulse quickening. "Where's the key?" Beatrice frowned. "I don't know. Eleanor had a small box of keys, but I haven't seen this one before." Jonathan cursed under his breath, trying to pry the drawer open with his fingers. Damn it, it could be in here. Miss Marple, who had been observing quietly from the doorway, finally spoke. "Patience, dear boy. Desks, particularly those of women with secrets, are never without hidden compartments." She stepped forward, running a delicate hand along the edges of the drawer. Then, with a small smile, she pressed against the side panel. There was a faint click, and the drawer slid open. Beatrice inhaled sharply. "How?" Miss Marple's expression was serene. "My nephew had a writing desk much like this. Manufacturers do love their hidden compartments." Jonathan ignored the commentary and reached inside. His fingers brushed against something thin and folded. A letter. His heart pounded as he pulled it free. It was addressed simply, to be read only in death. Harriet, who had just arrived, let out a dramatic gasp. "Well, I never." Jonathan didn't waste a second. He unfolded the letter with trembling hands and began to read. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the past cannot remain buried any longer. The child, she did not die as I claimed. She was taken, and the one who took her still walks among us." A heavy silence filled the room. Jonathan's hands shook. "Taken? What does that mean?" Miss Marple's lips pursed. "My dear boy, I believe it means murder." Beatrice covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Harriet, for once, was speechless. Jonathan turned back to the letter, his vision blurring. But before he could read further, a sudden noise from outside made them all freeze. Footsteps. Slow, measured. And then, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to listen at the door. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the shadow moving beneath the gap in the doorway. She rose swiftly and pulled the door open. A figure stood there, startled. It was Reverend Finch. His face was unreadable, but in his eyes, just for a moment, there was something unmistakable. Fear. Chapter 4. A man with secrets. A heavy silence filled the corridor as Reverend Finch stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. His fingers twitched at his sides, his eyes flicking between the letter in Jonathan's hands and Miss Marple's steady gaze. "My dear Reverend," Miss Marple said, her voice light but pointed. "How very curious to find you listening at the door." Finch straightened, his jaw tightening. "I wasn't. I only happened to pass by." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, come now, Reverend. You were eavesdropping." Finch's lips pressed together, his composure wavering for just a second. He turned toward Miss Marple, perhaps sensing she was the true danger in the room. "Is this really necessary, Miss Marple? A woman is dead. Must we drag up old wounds?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together softly. "Old wounds do have a way of festering, I'm afraid." And Eleanor herself seemed rather insistent that the truth come to light. Finch inhaled deeply, rubbing his temple. I should go." Jonathan blocked his path. "Not before you explain why you're so interested in my stepmother's affairs." His voice was sharp, laced with something dark, perhaps the first stirrings of suspicion. Beatrice Lane, standing off to the side, spoke hesitantly. "Reverend, you knew, didn't you?" The room held its breath. Reverend Finch swallowed. "Knew what?" Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "That Eleanor's secret child did not die of natural causes. That she was taken." A flicker of panic crossed Finch's face. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Jonathan stepped forward. "Who took her?" I don't know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, but I think you do, Reverend." Finch's breathing grew unsteady. "You don't understand," he said, almost pleading. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Then help us understand." There was a long pause, and then, finally, Finch exhaled. "It was many years ago," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I was young, newly ordained. Eleanor came to me one evening, desperate for guidance. She told me her husband had strayed, that he had a child no one could ever know about. The girl lived in a nearby village, cared for by a woman who was paid well to keep her hidden. His voice grew heavier, laden with the weight of the past. One day, the child vanished. The woman who had been caring for her was found dead. An accident, they said, but Eleanor, she was terrified. She told me she believed someone had taken the girl, that she feared for her life. And then, she never spoke of it again. A cold shiver ran through the room. Harriet Longford, who had been uncharacteristically silent, folded her arms. You mean to tell us a child was stolen, possibly murdered, and Eleanor simply moved on? Finch hesitated. I think she knew who took the girl. Jonathan's fingers curled into fists. Who? Finch shook his head. She never said. And I didn't ask. His eyes darkened. Perhaps I should have. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment before turning to Jonathan. May I see the letter again? Jonathan handed it to her, his fingers still trembling. She reread the words carefully. The child, she did not die as I claimed. She was taken, and the one who took her still walks among us. Miss Marple tapped a finger against the paper. It is rather curious, don't you think? Eleanor did not say the one who took her lives among us. She said walks among us. Beatrice frowned. What's the difference? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A very significant one, my dear. Walks among us suggests that Eleanor saw this person regularly, that the culprit was someone she interacted with. The realization settled over them like a thick fog. Reverend Finch's voice was barely a whisper. You mean, it was someone here in the village? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. I rather think it must have been. A hush followed. The implications were chilling. Jonathan ran a hand over his face. This means someone, perhaps. Someone in this very house was responsible. Harriet exhaled sharply. Well, I can tell you it wasn't me. Inspector Grayson, who had remained quiet until now, let out a sigh. All very dramatic, I'm sure. But if we don't even know who the child was, what are we meant to do with this? Miss Marple's lips pursed. That, dear Inspector, is the question we must answer. She turned back to Finch. Tell me, Reverend, did Eleanor ever mention the child's name? Finch hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, she never said. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A late-night visitor that night. As Miss Marple prepared for bed, she sat at her small writing desk, the letter laid out before her. Her mind whirred with questions. Who was the missing child? Why had Eleanor lied for so many years? And most importantly, who had she been afraid of? A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned toward the door. Come in. The door creaked open, and Beatrice Lane stepped inside. She looked uneasy, her hands clasped together. I had to speak to you, she said softly. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. Of course, my dear. Beatrice hesitated. There's something I didn't say earlier. Miss Marple nodded. ENCOURAGINGLY. Beatrice swallowed hard. When Eleanor was dying, she wasn't entirely lucid. She would mutter things that didn't make sense. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Go on, Beatrice exhaled. One night, she grabbed my wrist and said, the eyes, Beatrice, look at the eyes. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside, a sharp realization clicked into place. Did she say anything else? Beatrice nodded. She said, he'll know. He always knew. Miss Marple tapped a finger against the desk. And do you think she was referring to anyone in particular? Beatrice hesitated. Well, I thought she was rambling. But, now, I wonder. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. The eyes, Beatrice, look at the eyes. The weight of the words settled over them. Outside, the village was silent, but inside Miss Marple's mind, the puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place. Someone knew more than they were saying, and Miss Marple intended to find out exactly who. Chapter 5. The eyes of the past morning broke with a thin mist, rolling over the village, curling around chimneys like ghostly fingers. Inside the Whitcomb house, the atmosphere was just as thick with uncertainty. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, stirring a cup of tea, her mind replaying Beatrice's words from the night before. The eyes, Beatrice, look at the eyes. It was an odd statement, but not without significance. Eleanor Whitcomb had been dying, her mind, perhaps clouded by pain and fever. But even so, the words had meaning, and Miss Marple had long learned that a dying person's final words were rarely meaningless. Across the table, Jonathan sat stiffly, his plate untouched. Inspector Grayson was reviewing his notes while Harriet Longford and Beatrice sat in quiet contemplation. Reverend Finch had excused himself early, citing a need to prepare for Sunday's sermon. The tension was palpable. Miss Marple finally spoke. "Jonathan dear, might I ask what color were Eleanor's eyes?" Jonathan blinked, startled. "Her eyes, they were blue." Miss Marple nodded, deep in thought. "And her late husband?" Jonathan frowned. "Dark brown, if I recall." Miss Marple tapped her teaspoon thoughtfully against the saucer. "And yourself?" He hesitated. "Blue." A small, knowing smile crossed Miss Marple's lips. "Curious, isn't it?" Harriet scoffed. "What does eye color have to do with anything? We've a missing child to find, or at the very least, determine what happened to her." Miss Marple turned her gaze to her. "Precisely, my dear. And genetics, while not always definitive, can be quite revealing." Jonathan shifted in his seat. "Are you suggesting that if Eleanor's husband had brown eyes, then a child of his should have also had brown eyes?" Miss Marple nodded. "It would have been more likely, yes. Unless, of course," she trailed off meaningfully. Beatrice's breath hitched. "Unless he was not the true father." Jonathan's face darkened. "Are you saying Eleanor lied about the child's parentage?" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "I am merely saying that Eleanor may not have told the full truth, and that perhaps someone else in this village knows far more than they are admitting." A heavy silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Inspector Grayson chuckled. "Forgive me, Miss Marple, but this is beginning to sound like one of those ridiculous detective novels." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "Oh, I do hope so, Inspector." A visit to the past later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, her sharp eyes taking in every small detail. If Eleanor had hidden her child's true identity, someone in the village must have known. She found herself at the rectory, where Reverend Finch was pacing in his small study. He started when he saw her at the door. "Miss Marple," he said, warily, "what brings you here?" She smiled pleasantly. "Oh, nothing of great importance, my dear Reverend. I merely wished to ask a few questions." Finch hesitated but then stepped aside, allowing her in. The study smelled of old books and damp wood. The curtains drawn against the afternoon light. Miss Marple sat primly in a chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Reverend, I was thinking about something you said earlier about how Eleanor came to you for guidance when the child disappeared." Finch's throat bobbed. "Yes, you said Eleanor was terrified, that she feared someone had taken the child. Did she ever suggest who?" Finch's hands tightened on the chair. "No, she only said that the child was gone. But I always suspected that someone in the village knew more." Miss Marple observed him carefully. "And why is that?" Finch hesitated. "Because, some months after the child vanished, Eleanor changed. She became more withdrawn. She avoided certain people she had once been close to." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And who were those people?" Reverend Finch swallowed hard. "The late Dr. Howard, and Margaret Ashworth." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Margaret Ashworth, the widow who used to run the village orphanage?" Finch nodded. "Yes, Eleanor stopped speaking to her entirely." Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger against the arm of the chair. "Interesting." Finch exhaled shakily. "Miss Marple, I must ask, why are you so determined to dredge up these old ghosts?" She gave him a kind smile. "Because, my dear Reverend, I have found that ghosts never truly stay buried." The Ashworth connection. Armed with this new information, Miss Marple made her way to the small cottage where Margaret Ashworth now lived. The elderly woman was frail, her hands trembling as she poured tea, but her eyes, deep-set and sharp, still held a glimmer of the past. Miss Marple accepted her tea gracefully. "It has been many years since we last spoke, Margaret." Margaret smiled weakly. "Yes, well, I've not had much company lately." Miss Marple studied her over the rim of her teacup. "I was speaking with Reverend Finch today. He mentioned that Eleanor Whitcomb and you were once quite close." Margaret's fingers tensed slightly around the teapot. "We were, but that changed, didn't it?" Margaret inhaled shakily. "Eleanor, she had her reasons." Miss Marple waited patiently. Margaret sighed. "I knew about the child. Everyone assumes Eleanor's husband fathered her, but that's not true." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then who was the father?" Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "It was Dr. Howard." A sharp silence filled the room. Miss Marple's mind raced. Dr. Howard, respected, trusted, long deceased. If he had been the true father, that changed everything. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. And did Eleanor know? Margaret nodded. She did, but she only found out after. The child was gone. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Margaret, what happened to the girl? Margaret's eyes filled with something deep, something painful. She didn't just disappear, Miss Marple, she was taken. And I think Eleanor always knew by whom. Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. Who? Margaret's hands trembled as she placed her teacup down. I don't know for certain, but Eleanor, she once said something to me before she cut me out of her life. Miss Marple leaned forward. Margaret's voice was shaky. She said, I looked into his eyes, and I knew what he had done. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting bag. The eyes, she murmured, the pieces were coming together now, and she had a very strong suspicion about who those eyes belonged to. Chapter 6. Shadows of the past. Miss Marple walked back through the village, her thoughts churning. The revelation about Dr. Howard being the father of Eleanor's child had altered everything. If Eleanor had known the truth, then someone else must have known as well, and that someone had taken the child. She considered Margaret Ash's words. I looked into his eyes, and I knew what he had done. Who had Eleanor seen? And more importantly, what had she realized? As Miss Marple approached the Whitcomb house, she found Jonathan standing outside, smoking a cigarette, his expression distant. She paused beside him. A penny for your thoughts, dear. Jonathan exhaled slowly. I was thinking about my stepmother. It's strange, isn't it? All these years, I thought I knew her. And yet, it seems she was hiding something monumental. Miss Marple nodded. Secrets have a way of twisting themselves into a person's life. Jonathan, they become part of the very fabric of who they are. Jonathan gave a bitter laugh. And now, I must wonder if she lied about the child. What else did she lie about? Miss Marple studied him carefully. That, my dear, is exactly what we must uncover. A sudden disturbance inside the house. Tension simmered. Beatrice Lane was pacing the drawing room, her hands clenched together. Harriet Longford sat stiffly by the fireplace, her sharp eyes darting between the others. Inspector Grayson leaned against the sideboard, watching them all with his usual air of skepticism. It was Beatrice who finally broke the silence. I can't stop thinking about it, the child. If she didn't die, then where did she go? Harriet scoffed. That's assuming she's still alive. Miss Marple set her knitting bag down. We mustn't make assumptions, dear. The facts will lead us where we need to go. Beatrice turned to her, desperation flickering in her eyes. Miss Marple, do you think Eleanor knew where her child was? Miss Marple considered this. Not necessarily, but I do believe she knew who was responsible for taking her. Inspector Grayson sighed. And yet, we have no idea who that person is. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. Oh, but I believe we do. All eyes turned to her. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Eleanor said she looked into his eyes and knew, which means the person who took the child was someone she had trusted, someone she had known for years. Harriet frowned. That could be anyone in this house. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not quite. There is one person who had both the access and the ability to make a child disappear. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Jonathan, startled, moved to answer it. The door creaked open to reveal Reverend Finch, his expression dark and troubled. I need to speak with Miss Marple. A confession in the study. Miss Marple followed Finch into the study, closing the door behind them. He was pacing, his hands twisting together. I can't keep this to myself anymore, he said abruptly. I must tell you what I know. Miss Marple sat in an armchair, waiting patiently. Finch inhaled sharply. I knew about the child. Not just that she existed, but more. Eleanor confided in me after she found out Dr. Howard was the father. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Go on, Finch swallowed. Eleanor never forgave him. She was heartbroken. But then, something worse happened. Miss Marple tilted her head. The child disappeared. Finch nodded. Yes, and Eleanor was beside herself. She was convinced someone had taken her to punish her, or perhaps to keep her quiet. Miss Marple tapped a finger against the armrest. Did she ever confront Dr. Howard? Finch hesitated. I believe she did, but after that, she never spoke of him again. And then, well, Dr. Howard died not long after, didn't he? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Indeed. And tell me, Reverend, who conducted his funeral? Finch's breath caught. I did. A heavy silence stretched between them. Miss Marple spoke gently. You saw him last. You saw him in his coffin. Finch nodded slowly. Yes. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but her words were pointed. And did you look into his eyes? Finch froze. The study was deathly silent. Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. You know, don't you? Finch's hands trembled. Miss Marple leaned forward. Reverend, tell me. When Eleanor said, I looked into his eyes and knew. Was she talking about Dr. Howard? Finch exhaled shakily. No. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Then who? Finch's voice was hoarse. The man who prepared Dr. Howard's body. Miss Marple stilled. The undertaker. Finch nodded. Yes. His assistant, to be precise. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. The undertaker's assistant. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. Reverend, who was the assistant at the time. Finch hesitated, then whispered a name. Miss Marple's breath caught, because the name he spoke belonged to someone she had already suspected. A name from the past. Miss Marple emerged from the study, her expression unreadable. The others looked up. Expectantly. Jonathan frowned. Well, Miss Marple sat down, adjusting her knitting needles. I believe we are much closer to our answer. Beatrice leaned forward. Miss Marple, who was Eleanor afraid of Miss Marple's voice was steady. Someone who worked in the shadows. Someone who had access to the bodies of the dead. Harriet inhaled sharply. You mean? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the undertaker's assistant. The man who handled Dr. Howard's body after his death. Inspector Grayson folded his arms. And who was that? Miss Marple's eyes met his. The very man who has been watching us from the edges of this mystery. Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper. Who? Miss Marple's lips parted, and she spoke a single name, a name that sent a chill through the room. The true suspect had been hiding in plain sight. Chapter 7. The man in the shadows. A thick silence followed Miss Marple's pronouncement. Every person in the room sat motionless, their breath held in anticipation. Inspector Grayson was the first to speak. His voice was skeptical but tinged with intrigue. Are you telling me, Miss Marple, that the undertaker's assistant we've barely mentioned before is the key to this entire mystery? Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. I do believe so, Inspector. It was Eleanor's dying words that led me to this conclusion. The eyes, Beatrice, look at the eyes. She meant something very specific. Beatrice Lane swallowed. And now we know she had once said something similar to Margaret Ashworth. I looked into his eyes and knew. Jonathan's brows furrowed. But why would she fear the undertaker's assistant? Miss Marple folded her hands primly. Because, my dear, he was the last person to handle Dr. Howard's body before burial. If Eleanor had any lingering doubts about her child's disappearance, they were confirmed when she saw his face. Harriet Longford, who had been silent thus far, suddenly spoke, her voice sharp. That man, his name was Albert Colston, wasn't it? Inspector Grayson's head snapped toward her. You know him? Harriet hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he worked for old Mr. Trench, the village undertaker, before he passed away. Albert Colston was always peculiar. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. How so? Harriet tapped her fingers against the armrest. Quiet, kept to himself. But there was something about him that unsettled me. It was the way he watched people. Inspector Grayson straightened. And where is this Albert Colston now? Harriet's lips thinned. He still lives here, in a small cottage by the churchyard. A heavy pause followed. Then Miss Marple stood. Well then, my dears, I do believe it's time we paid him a visit. The cottage by the churchyard. Bert Colston's cottage stood at the edge of the churchyard, its ivy-covered walls blending with the surrounding headstones. Miss Marple, Inspector Grayson, and Jonathan approached cautiously, while Beatrice and Harriet remained behind, watching from a distance. The door was slightly ajar. Inspector Grayson frowned. That's odd. Jonathan hesitated. Should we knock? Miss Marple gave him a reassuring look. I believe a gentle approach would be best. She stepped forward and lightly pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. Inside, Albert Colston sat in an old wooden chair, staring at the fire. His hair was thin and gray, his fingers bony and still. He didn't look up as they entered. Mr. Colston, Miss Marple said softly. Slowly, his gaze lifted. His eyes were pale, almost watery, yet there was an unsettling sharpness behind them. You've come, he murmured. I knew someone would, eventually. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, his stance authoritative. Mr. Colston, we have some questions for you. Albert gave a slow nod. I imagine you do. Miss Marple sat in the chair opposite him, her voice gentle. You were the undertaker's assistant when Dr. Howard died, were you not? Albert's lips curled slightly. I was. And Eleanor Whitcomb, she saw you then, didn't she? A flicker of something, was it fear? Passed across his features. She did, he admitted. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And when she looked into your eyes, she knew something, didn't she? Albert was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled heavily. She knew the truth. Jonathan stiffened. What truth? Albert's gaze flickered toward the window, as if looking into the past. Dr. Howard didn't just die, he said quietly. He was silenced. A hush fell over the room. Inspector Grayson's jaw tightened. Are you saying he was murdered? Albert gave a slow nod. And Eleanor knew it the moment she saw me. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Who killed him, Mr. Colston? Albert's lips pressed together. The same person who took Eleanor's child. Jonathan's breath caught. Who? Albert hesitated, then whispered a name, and the room went deathly still. The final betrayal, Albert's confession, had shaken them all. The name he spoke was one they had not expected as they left the cottage. Inspector Grayson muttered, I don't believe it. Miss Marple, however, was unshaken. Oh, but it makes sense, Inspector. Jonathan was pale. But how could it be? After all these years, Miss Marple glanced at him sympathetically. Because, my dear, some crimes remain hidden for a very long time, but sooner or later, the truth finds its way to the surface. Beatrice and Harriet approached as they returned. Well, Beatrice asked urgently. Inspector Grayson rubbed his temple. We have a name. Harriet narrowed her eyes, and Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. We must confront them immediately. Jonathan inhaled sharply. You mean? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the person who took Eleanor's child is still among us. A heavy silence followed. Then, with quiet determination, they set off toward their next destination. The confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 8. Confronting the Truth village seemed eerily quiet as Miss Marple, Inspector Grayson, Jonathan, Beatrice, and Harriet made their way back from Albert Colston's cottage. The weight of his words still hung heavily in the air. Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper. I still can't believe it. Inspector Grayson muttered, it makes no sense. Why would they take the child? Why kill Dr. Howard? Miss Marple, walking steadily ahead, glanced at him. Oh, but it does make sense, Inspector. A terrible kind of sense. They reached the Whitcomb house, where the remaining guests were waiting in tense anticipation. As the group stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Eyes darted around the room, wary and uncertain. Margaret Ashworth stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly. You've learned something, haven't you? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear. We now know who took Eleanor's child. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Beatrice whispered, Who? Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes moved from one face to another before she spoke the name clearly. Harriet Longford. A deadly silence. Heads turned to Harriet. She remained utterly still, her face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she let out a soft, almost amused chuckle. Well, Miss Marple, you certainly are persistent. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Is it true? Did you take the child? Harriet sighed. What difference does it make now? Inspector Grayson's voice was firm. A great deal of difference, Miss Longford. You are accused of kidnapping a child, and possibly murder. Harriet looked away, her jaw tightening. I saved that child, she said finally. But Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unyielding. Did you, my dear? Or did you take her to silence Eleanor forever? Harriet's eyes flashed. Eleanor was selfish, foolish. She would have ruined everything. Beatrice gasped. My God, you did take her. Jonathan took a step forward. Where is she? Harriet. Harriet exhaled, looking down at her hands. She's gone. She was adopted by a couple far away from here. She had a good life. Miss Marple studied her carefully. And Dr. Howard, did you kill him as well? Harriet's face darkened. He deserved it. He abandoned Eleanor. He would have abandoned the child, too. Inspector Grayson's voice was sharp. So you poisoned him. Harriet shook her head. I didn't need to. He was ill. All I did was ensure his medicine was misplaced. A chill ran through the room. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Ah, you let nature take its course. Harriet's lips curled slightly. I suppose you could put it that way. Jonathan's voice was hoarse, and Eleanor went. She found out. Harriet's expression hardened. She didn't deserve to know. Miss Marple sighed. But she did find out, didn't she? That's why you killed her. Harriet's fingers twitched, but she said nothing. Inspector Grayson took a step forward. Miss Longford, I am placing you under arrest. Harriet let out a small, bitter laugh. It was all for nothing, wasn't it? No one answered. As Inspector Grayson led her away, the room fell into a deep, heavy silence. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The truth had been uncovered, but at what cost? Chapter 9. The unfinished, puzzled parlor of Whitcomb House felt hollow after Harriet Longford's arrest. The fire crackled softly, yet no one spoke. Beatrice sat stiffly in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as though they were the only thing keeping her upright. Jonathan stood by the window, staring into the darkness beyond, while Margaret Ashworth paced, her shoes tapping against the wooden floor. MissMarple.com, as ever, poured herself a cup of tea. Harriet Longford was responsible for much, but there is still something missing, she mused aloud. Jonathan turned sharply. What do you mean, something missing? Harriet admitted it. She took the child, let Dr. Howard die, and silenced Eleanor. When she found out, what more is there? Miss Marple took a sip of tea before answering. Oh, my dear, that's precisely the problem. Harriet admitted too much, but not to murder. Margaret stopped pacing. But she practically confessed. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she confessed to taking the child and to withholding Dr. Howard's medicine. But when it came to Eleanor's death, she said nothing. A deep silence followed. Beatrice inhaled sharply. Are you suggesting? Miss Marple set down her teacup. That Harriet may not have been Eleanor's murderer at all. Jonathan's face paled. Then, someone else killed her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It would seem so. An unsettling realization. Grayson returned just as the tension in the room reached its peak. He dusted off his hands and sighed. Harriet's being taken into custody. She'll be questioned formally in the morning. He glanced at the others. Why do you all look as if you've seen a ghost? Miss Marple folded her hands primly. Because, Inspector, we may have arrested the wrong person for Eleanor's murder. Grayson scowled. Oh, not this again. Miss Marple, the woman, practically admitted to everything. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. She admitted to taking the child, and to Dr. Howard's death, but not to the murder of Eleanor. I found that rather telling. Inspector Grayson opened his mouth to protest, but then stopped. His frown deepened. So what are you saying? Miss Marple glanced at Beatrice, then at Margaret. I am saying, Inspector, that there is still a murderer among us. A heavy silence settled over the room. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. But who? Miss Marple's sharp gaze settled on Margaret Ashworth. I rather think you know the answer to that, my dear. A shocking revelation. Margaret stiffened. What are you saying, Miss Marple? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. You were the one who first mentioned Eleanor's words to you, were you not? I looked into his eyes and knew. Margaret swallowed. Yes, I suppose I did. And yet, Eleanor never actually told you what she meant by that, did she? Margaret's eyes darted toward the door. I know, she never said. Miss Marple smiled gently. That's quite interesting, my dear. Because Eleanor did tell someone what she had discovered. Beatrice gasped. Albert Colston. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, she saw something. Something that frightened her terribly, but it was not Harriet that she feared. Jonathan took a shaky breath. Then who? Miss Marple turned back to Margaret. You, my dear. The room seemed to freeze. Margaret's eyes widened. That is absurd. She snapped off. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, yet unwavering. Is it? Let us examine the facts. Eleanor saw something in someone's eyes. She connected it to her missing child, to the past. She must have realized that the true danger had never left her side. Inspector Grayson's voice was sharp. Miss Marple, are you saying? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. Margaret Ashworth is Eleanor's lost child. A collective gasp rang through the parlor. Jonathan staggered backward. That's impossible. Beatrice covered her mouth. Dear Lord. Margaret, who had remained frozen in shock, suddenly stood. You have no proof of that. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Oh, but I do. Eleanor's reaction, her dying words, and most of all, her fear. She wasn't afraid of Harriet, she was afraid of you. Because the truth of who you really were had finally come to light. Margaret's hands trembled. This is madness. Miss Marple shook her head. It is the truth. Eleanor's child was taken away, hidden in plain sight. She was raised under a new name, given a new life. And when Eleanor realized that you were her daughter, she must have been desperate to tell you. But you didn't want to hear it, did you, Margaret? Margaret took a step back, her breathing ragged. Stop it. Jonathan looked at her, horrified. Margaret, is it true? Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. I didn't mean to kill her, she whispered. I didn't. Beatrice gasped. Oh, Margaret. Inspector Grayson's expression hardened. So you did do it? Margaret sank into a chair. I just wanted her to stop. She kept saying it, kept telling me I was her daughter. I didn't want to believe it. I had a family, a life. I wasn't hers. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. And so you silenced her. Margaret let out a shaky breath. I pushed her, just a little. I didn't think she hit her head. There was so much blood. Jonathan turned away, his face pale. Inspector Grayson stepped forward. Margaret Ashworth, you are under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Whitcomb. Margaret's shoulders sagged. I suppose I always knew it would come to this. As the inspector led her away, silence settled once more. Beatrice wiped her eyes. It's over. Miss Marple, ever composed, took another sip of tea. Yes, my dear, it is. Chapter 10. Shadows of the Past. Air in Whitcomb House felt hollow. In the wake of Margaret Ashworth's arrest, the tension that had gripped the parlor all evening was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that no one seemed willing to break. Beatrice sat with her head bowed, absently twisting the ring on her finger, while Jonathan stood motionless near the mantelpiece, staring at the dying embers of the fire. Miss Marple, seated in her usual composed manner, stirred her tea gently. It is always the past that catches up with us, she murmured. Beatrice lifted her head. I still cannot believe it. Jonathan ran a hand over his face. Margaret Teleno's own daughter. And she never knew. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes flickered. Oh, but she did know, my dear. That is what frightened her so. Inspector Grayson, standing near the door, sighed. And in the end, the truth cost her life. He shook his head. A tragedy, really. Jonathan turned suddenly. What will happen to Margaret now? Grayson exhaled. She'll be charged, of course. A court will decide her fate. A silence fell once more. Miss Marple set down her teacup. If I may, Inspector, I do wonder, was it truly murder? Grayson frowned. You were the one who proved she killed Eleanor. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector, she did. But not with malice. She acted in a moment of fear, of denial. A dreadful thing, but not necessarily the same as a calculated murder. Beatrice clutched her hands together. You mean, she may not hang? Grayson hesitated. That will be up to the court. But if Miss Marple is correct, then perhaps. Jonathan let out a heavy breath. What a terrible mess. Miss Marple gave him a kind but knowing smile. The past has a way of surfacing, my dear, whether we wish it to or not. Reflections and farewells. Following morning, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the village, reflecting on the case. The events of the past week had been harrowing, but justice, in its own way, had prevailed. As she reached the village square, she found Albert Colston waiting for her near the churchyard. He gave her a small nod of greeting. You were right about everything, Miss Marple. She smiled gently. Not everything, Mr. Colston, but enough, he sighed. So Margaret was Eleanor's lost child. I still can't believe it. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. Perhaps it is better this way. Eleanor longed for her daughter, but the past had already shaped Margaret into someone else. Perhaps it was kinder not to know. Albert looked away. And what will happen now? Miss Marple glanced toward the horizon. Life will go on, Mr. Colston, as it always does. Final reflection. Afternoon. Miss Marple boarded a train back to St. Mary Mead. As she settled into her seat, she gazed out the window, watching the countryside roll past. Another case solved. Another tragedy laid to rest. She sighed softly, folding her hands in her lap. The past is never truly buried, she murmured. It only waits to be uncovered. And with that, the train carried her home. Chapter 11. The weight of justice. A week had passed since the shocking revelations at Whitcomb House, and the village of Little Darrow was slowly settling into an uneasy calm. The gossip had not yet died down. How could it, when such a scandal had unfolded before their very eyes? A woman murdered, a hidden past unearthed, and a daughter who had unknowingly killed her own mother. The tale seemed too tragic to be true, yet it was. Miss Marple had remained in the village a little longer than expected. waiting for the final turn of events. She now found herself seated in the drawing room of the vicarage, opposite Jonathan Whitcomb and Beatrice, who had invited her for tea. Jonathan, looking more composed than he had in days, set down his cup. "They say Margaret may not face the gallows after all," he said quietly. Beatrice, seated beside him, nodded. The solicitors believed she acted in the heat of the moment. It wasn't premeditated. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "That is, as I suspected. The court may find her guilty of manslaughter rather than murder." Jonathan let out a breath. "I cannot say I pity her, but I do not wish her to suffer more than necessary." Beatrice sighed. "It is all so terrible. I keep wondering if Eleanor had only spoken to her more gently, if Margaret had listened. Could it all have been avoided?" Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "My dear, one cannot change the past. We can only learn from it." Jonathan looked at her keenly. "And what lesson do you take from all this, Miss Marple?" She paused, gazing out the window. "That the truth will always come to light, whether we wish it to or not." A quiet trial. Margaret Ashworth's trial took place in a courtroom far from Little Darrow, away from the prying eyes of the villagers. The papers covered it, of course, though with less sensationalism than might have been expected. The defense painted a portrait of a woman caught in a moment of overwhelming emotion, struggling with a truth too great to bear. When the verdict was read, it was as Miss Marple had predicted: manslaughter, not murder. Margaret would serve a sentence, but she would not hang. Miss Marple received a letter from Inspector Grayson with the news. She read it over her breakfast, nodding slightly. "As it should be," she murmured. "Farewells, and new beginnings." As the village returned to its usual rhythm, Jonathan and Beatrice prepared to leave Whitcomb House. "I cannot stay here," Jonathan admitted to Miss Marple as they walked through the garden. "Too many ghosts." Beatrice squeezed his hand. "We shall make a fresh start." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "A wise decision, my dears. The past will always be here, but the future is yours to shape." They thanked her warmly, knowing that without her keen mind and unwavering persistence, the truth might have remained buried forever. As she prepared to leave Little Darrow at last, Miss Marple took one final look at Whitcomb House. The tragedy was over, but the memories would remain, and so, with her knitting in hand and a knowing smile, she stepped onto the train home. Miss Marple sat in a quiet corner of the train carriage, her hands resting lightly on her knitting. The rhythmic chugging of the locomotive and the gentle swaying of the carriage were almost soothing, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of events she had witnessed in Little Darrow. She had seen justice done, and yet, as the rolling countryside passed her window, she found herself wondering, was justice ever truly complete? She set her knitting aside for a moment, gazing out thoughtfully. Margaret Ashworth had not meant to kill Eleanor Whitcomb. The poor woman had been overwhelmed by the sudden revelation of her true parentage, of a life she had never known, was hers. In her panic, she had acted without thinking, and the consequences had been tragic. The court had seen reason, granting her a sentence for manslaughter rather than murder, but still, Miss Marple sighed. Justice was never so simple as judges and verdicts. It was not only Margaret who had suffered. Beatrice and Jonathan had lost a dear friend, their world shaken by the past. The village itself had been unsettled, a quiet place, disrupted by scandal. Even Harriet Longford, whose actions had set so much in motion, would now live out the rest of her days in prison. And Eleanor, poor Eleanor. She had searched for her child, only to die at her daughter's hands. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her fingers working the needles with quiet precision. Life, she thought, was very much like a tapestry. Threads intertwined in ways one could never quite anticipate. Some knots could be untangled, others had to remain as they were. A conversation on Justice's train pulled into a station along the way, and as it did, an unexpected voice called out, "Miss Marple, what a surprise!" She turned to see none other than Inspector Grayson, stepping into the carriage with a weary smile. "Inspector," she greeted, surprised but pleased. "How curious to see you here." Grayson sat across from her, removing his hat. "Just back from the city. Paperwork, you know. And you?" "On my way home," she said, resuming her knitting. "The case is over, after all." Grayson sighed. "Yes, over." He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Do you think justice was served, Miss Marple?" She didn't answer at once. The needles clicked gently as she finished a row. "Justice," she said at last, "is a complicated thing. The law follows reason, but people are not always reasonable, are they?" Grayson snorted. That's the truth. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Margaret Ashworth acted in fear, not malice. The court recognized that, but her guilt will not vanish, nor will the pain of those left behind. Justice is not only what happens in a courtroom, Inspector. It is what people must live with afterwards. Grayson tapped his fingers on his knee. That's a rather sobering way of looking at it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Well, Inspector, I have lived a long time. I have seen many cases where the guilty go free, and the innocent suffer. Justice is not always a matter of law. Grayson nodded slowly. A fair point. The train whistle blew, signaling their departure. Grayson settled back into his seat. I suppose you'll be glad to return to St. Mary Mead, a quieter life. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, my dear Inspector, I find that trouble has a way of finding me, even in the quietest of places. Grayson laughed. That I don't doubt. One last Mr. train journey continued, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green fields and quaint villages. As the inspector dozed in his seat, Miss Marple continued knitting, her mind still turning over the case. One thought lingered, something she had not voiced. What if Eleanor had not died? Had things gone differently? Had she lived long enough to tell Margaret everything? What then? Would Margaret have accepted her, or would she still have turned away? The past was a heavy thing. Not all truths set one free. And yet, Miss Marple believed Eleanor would have forgiven Margaret, in time. That, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all. The whistle blew again, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, ready to disembark. As she stepped onto the platform at St. Mary Mead, she breathed in the familiar air, home, and with that, the case of Eleanor Whitcomb was truly closed. The end. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.